Hi folks, this is Brian, and today I'm going to take you on a tour of mosses of the Northwoods. In case you have a chance to get out there this week to look for moss vouchers to put in this week, or if you just want to be able to know where to look for interesting mosses when you come here in the future. So come along for the ride. So we're starting today at the edge of the Northwoods across from the greenhouse parking lot. And there's an entrance to the Northwoods right here, the main trail going in. And right out in front of here is a red maple tree. And you might say, well, where are the mosses? Well, they're everywhere. Mosses can inhabit many habitats as long as they have enough moisture and it isn't too severe environment. They can thrive anywhere. Right in front of us, we have a number of soil mosses. And the predominant mosses in here are Plagiothecium and Atricum, and I'll get you a close-up of those. So right here on the soil, at the entrance of Northwoods, are a couple of soil mosses. Now notice that mosses like to grow where they aren't covered with leaves. One of the major problems for mosses in the forest is that when they're covered with leaves, they can't photosynthesize, and so they die out. So bare soil, which is bare here because Lands and Grounds blows the leaves off, can colonize mosses on soil. This is a moss known as Plagionium, and it is a broad-leaved moss. It is a pleurocarp type moss, which means that it branches and tends to make large patches. It doesn't stand up straight. These soil mosses are in the genus Atricum, and there's a number of different species in Atricum, so you'd have to look at these under a microscope to get a closer identification, but they're probably either Atricum ultracristatum, or Atricum undulatum. So if you look in here, you can see that these are acrocarp type mosses. They stand upright and they don't branch. And they have wide leaves with a row of lamellae down the center of the leaf. So as we walk into the Northwoods, I'll talk to you about the importance of environment and habitat in identifying mosses. Very often the first question isn't what the moss looks like, but where it grows. And all of the field manuals divide mosses or make lists of mosses for those that grow on soil, on rock, on tree trunks at the base, on tree trunks up higher, on rotting logs, etc. But in all cases, they have to be locations that aren't covered by leaves. So this is a group of mosses growing on what was probably an old stump that's now rotted down. And the thing about mosses is that very often they aren't growing by themselves. This is mostly Tetraphis pellucida four-tooth moss with gemme cups. But we also have in here Dicranum with the fine wispy leaves, and even some others that are tucked in through here. So mosses grow in groups, and they're often competing with one another for their location. Now, when people think of moss habitats, they usually think of mosses growing on the north side of trees. The reason for this is that mosses are poikilohydric, which means that they aren't able to control their water loss. So they need to grow in places that stay moist longer. So yes, they do grow on the north side of trees, but if there's enough moisture, they'll grow all over the tree on all sides. On the south side and the west side of the trees, of course, and on rocks, they'll dry out faster. And this is a part of a rock wall in the Northwoods. And in this case, we have the aspect here is northeast, and there's mosses growing on this rock here. Now there's at least two kinds of mosses here, probably more, and plus a lot of lichens. We have growing on the edge as it creeps, this pleurocarp type moss that is oil spill moss, which is the genus Platygerium and the species repens, Platygerium repens. And the way to tell this moss is if you look at it with a hand lens, you can see little microphyllous branches that form little puffballs at the ends of some of the branches. We also have in here a very common acrocarp type moss, which has curly, crispy like leaves called crispy broom moss, and that is Dicranum montanum, which is one of the smallest of the Dicranum type mosses that grow here. So there's at least two mosses on here, one a pleurocarp type and one an acrocarp type. On the left side of the path as we walk in, we have a white oak tree, and at the base of the tree is growing mosses. And notice that we have mosses that grow up on the side of the tree. These have to be tolerant of drying out because they don't stay wet as long. And we have a lot of mosses growing at the base of the tree, progressing down into the soil. So at the base of the tree, you'll find a mix of mosses that may also occur on rocks or anywhere just off of the soil, and even some soil mosses will get in here as well. Some of the mosses that we would see here are this one right here, which makes traces or tracks across the trunk, the bark, and this is called train track moss, and the Latin name is Thelea, T-H-E-L-I-A, Hurtella, Thelea hurtella. And it's a lovely moss to look at under the microscope, but you can tell it out in nature because it grows in a line and has little laterals that come off at a regular spacing, almost like railroad ties. So that's why it's called train track moss. As we go down, we have Anomodon rostratus, A-N-O-M-D-O-N, Anomodon rostratus, which is called the yellow yarn moss, which has this yellow-green color. It's a very shiny pleurocarp type moss that's often found down at the base of trees. And as we go further down, we find another moss, which we'll look at more later on, which is called fern moss, and various other things that are tucked in here. So those are three different mosses growing at different levels on this tree. And if you get up high enough, you start to find black patches. And this is more of the Platygerium repens, the oil spill moss, which is very common on tree trunks. And moving around on the same tree, if you find these black squiggly lines growing on the tree, that's actually not a moss, it's a liverwort, which is a close relative. This is the New York scale wort. So coming off the trail on the right, keep your eyes open for rotten logs on the forest floor. Rotten logs are a wonderful habitat for mosses because they're typically blown free of leaves in the winter, and they hold a lot of moisture and all that rotting wood. A very common moss in our forests on rotting logs and up north just about everywhere is this beautiful brocade moss, which is Hypnum imponens, which I use as the voucher example for mosses this week. You can tell Hypnum because it has this very regular branching pattern and very shiny leaves that are pointed and curved like sickles off to one side. So they're called secund falcate. So it's a lovely moss called brocade moss, Hypnum imponens. On the same log, just down from the brocade moss, is another very common pleurocarp type moss, which is Calicladium haldanianum. And it creeps across the moss, and it has sharp pointed leaves and shiny foliage, and is very common on rotting logs. coming in off the path, we see a tree growing here with large green cushions at the base. These very fine foliaged mosses are Dicranum montanum. And in this case, you can see that it has enough moisture that it hasn't dried out and become crispy. And if you look at the inside of this, oops, I lost a piece. You can see that the base of the moss has red hairs that are woolly on the stem. Those are rhizoids, and there's a profusion of them. You can also see how the individual moss shoots stand upright. So this is an acrocarp type moss, Dicranum montanum, growing here and over here. Moving further up the tree, you can find little clumps of moss that form little tiny tufts on the tree. And these have capsules that flare at the tip and that rise just above the foliage. This is Eulota, U-L-O-T-A, hutchinsii, Eulota hutchinsii, which is very common, tufting, small acrocarp type tufting moss that grows on tree trunks up higher, not down near the bottom. Now, on our trees in the Northwoods and trees everywhere, there's also a lot of lichens, which are not mosses. And how do you tell the difference? Mosses have leaves that are green, and lichens are fungal thalli that associate with photosynthetic or blue-green algae. And they don't look like normal leaves. There's a huge variety of lichens, and lichens are very interesting to study, but they're not mosses, so don't attempt to identify those as mosses. So at many places along the path, very often on rocks, you'll find this lovely Dicranum type moss, and this is one of our most common Dicranums in this area. This is Dicranum scoparium, which is called the windswept broom moss. And it gets that name because the leaves are often swept off to one side, and it looks like they were blown by the wind. Dicranum scoparium, windswept broom moss. On this rock by the path, we have a combination of Hypnum imponens, which you see here, the brocade moss, and in amongst it is a sharp-leaved little acrocarp type moss called Polytrichum commune, and this is one of our most common mosses, often found in more stressful areas, and it's called the haircap moss. And it has, it's an acrocarp, so it's upright, and it has sharp leaves that are very thick. They actually are covered with vertical rows of cells called lamellae, and they have teeth on the edge of the leaf, and they come to a sharp point. And when they form capsules, the capsules have a calyptra, which is hairy, which is where the name haircap moss comes from. So that's Hypnum imponens and Polytrichum commune growing together. Further down the path, we have a tree, and at the base of the tree we have Dicranum montanum. And then over here we have a colony of Polytrichum commune, the common haircap moss. And growing off to one side is this moss, which has whitish leaves that are very stout. And if it's dry, they'll break and fall apart as you see here. So it's kind of brittle and they come apart pretty easily. This is called Leucobrium glaucum. And this is the one that forms the large silvery green mounds that you'll see very often. They can get up to a half a foot tall even, growing at the base of trees or on soil as you walk through the woods. So Leucobrium means white moss, and glaucum means white. So this is the white moss. Sometimes called pincushion moss. So Leucobrium glaucum, Polytrichum commune, and this small tree on the left of the path has these black clumps of New York scalewort, which the Latin is Frulania eboricensis. And this is a great one to look at with your hand lens. It's a liverwort, so it has dark leaves and a very different structure. And there's a lichen in there as well. It also, like Tilia, it forms train tracks sort of across the bark. Always very dark in color, and the leaves overlap, which is common with the liverworts and never happens in the mosses. Further down the path, off to the left, is a forked tree, and in the bottom of the fork is a very common moss in the woods here that grows at the base of trees and even on rocks in moist areas. And this is the fern moss, Thuidium delicatulum. And it's called fern moss because the leaves are multiply pinnate, like a fern. It is dull. It's not shiny because the leaves have tiny little bumps on the cells called papillae. So it's a papilliaceous moss. And this, of course, because it branches so much, is a pleurocarp type moss. So fern moss, very common, yellow-green, dull, and looks like little tiny fern leaves. Thuidium delicatulum. So we're now taking the trail downhill to the left. And you can see we have mosses at the base of trees, probably fern moss. Moss is growing on stumps, either fern moss or brocade moss. Moss growing in the middle of the path. This looks like it's probably brocade moss and maybe a mix of fern and brocade. And then we have areas where there's so much leaf litter, there are no mosses at all for quite a ways until you come to an opening. We came down the trail and turned left, and in the trail there's a number of rocks with mosses growing on them. We have Dicranum montanum with its very short leaves here. We have a little bit of hypnum growing in here. And we also have a little bit Dicranum scoparium, the windswept broom moss. And then right above it we have another Polytrichum. This one does not have teeth on the leaves if you look closely with the hand lens, and is often found in more severe areas. Here it's out in the open. And this is Polytrichum juniperinum. Another haircap moss, Polytrichum juniperinum. So just on this one rock, we probably have 5 or 6 or more mosses growing together. As we walk down the hill through the woods, on the left side of the path is a wonderful tree with moss growing up the side, and at the base we're on the north side of the tree. Up at the top we have train track moss, Thelea hirtella. And down at the bottom we have a good example of the yellow yarn moss, Anomodon rostratus, which has these long pointed leaves and tapering tips and the yellow-green color. Rather shaggy looking at the base of the tree. And then down at the bottom, where there's more moisture, we have Plagionium and other members of the Niaceae family, Mniuaceae family. As we come down the path, there's a trail off to the left that leads towards CBLS. We'll head over that way and see if we can find anything different. As we get into the lower areas of the woods here, you can see there are quite a few mosses on any area that's exposed, whether it's a rock, soil, or a tree. And in the lowest spots, where there's the most moisture, you'll find a lot of these, which are sphagnum mosses. Sphagnum mosses are very easy to identify as sphagnum but very difficult to tell to species. This one is pretty easy because of the color, which is a light green, and because of the leaves, which if you get close enough with a hand lens, you can see that the leaves are very blunt. And this is called the blunt-leaved peat moss, Sphagnum palustri. Palustri means of the swamp or of the wetlands. So that's one of our most common mosses down here, and you'll find it on clumping on rocks like we see here, and even closer here and down here. Almost all of this, I believe, is Sphagnum palustri, but never sure. Sphagnums are a very tough group to tell apart. Growing down in the lowest and wettest part of this dry, what is now a dry stream bed, is this rather nondescript moss. If you look at it from above, it has distinct leaves. It is an acrocarp. It has single stems that are standing up. It does have some capsules growing on it as well. If you look at this closer, you can see that it has dense red fuzz on the stems, and the leaves are costate and lanceolate. Costate means they have a midrib, and lanceolate means that they're narrow and tapering to a point. This is ribbed bog moss, Allocomnium palustri. Allocomnium palustri. Very distinctive with the red rhizoids that run all the way up the stem, and the habitat that it grows in, which is low, wet spots near streams. As we walk up out of the woods towards the chemistry quad, which is where we're going to stop next, you'll find many of the same species that we've already mentioned. Theridium growing in the base of a tree, the fern moss. Hypnum growing on a rotten log. Dicranum scoparium, and a variety of others. You'll find scalewort on trunks, any place where there's dark patches, etc. So keep your eyes out. Walking through the woods, another common dicranum is one that has intermediate length foliage, and that's called Dicranum fulvum, the boulder broom moss. It has a dull green appearance. The leaves aren't windswept the way you find on Dicranum scoparium. If you pick it up, you can still see that the stems are covered with red fuzz, the rhizoids, so it's very distinctive that way. If you pick the clump apart, you'll see that this is an acrocarp type moss. It doesn't branch, it grows vertically. It does have the very narrow leaves that curve off to one side, or various sides. And so this is Dicranum fulvum, very soft, something to lay your head on. The boulder broom moss, making these tight clumps. So if it's super short foliage, it's Dicranum montanum. If it's long and windswept, it's Dicranum scoparium. And if it's in between, it's Dicranum fulvum. And then there's a number of other dicranums that have their own characteristics. So we're coming out of the woods now, back to Flag Road. And again, along the edge, you'll find Plagiothecium, Plagionium, and Atricum, various Atricum species. So we're gonna head across the street and go look at some of the rocks growing just to the west of the Neurology Center. So we're now outside chemistry, to the north of chemistry and to the west of the neurosciences building. And in the lawn is a rock, and in the rock there are cracks which hold soil, and that is all that these mosses need. So I came out here yesterday just to take a look and ended up drawing what's called a moss map. And this moss map has sort of a diagram of the boulder, and I've drawn the different mosses that are on here, as you can see, very diagrammatically. And I identified 4 mosses here yesterday: Grimmia pilifera, Hedwigia ciliata, Bryum argentium, and Dicranum montanum, which we've already learned, but these other 3 are new for us. So in here, one of our most common rock mosses is this gray-green moss that tends to form very distinctive ropey branchlets. It's an acrocarp moss, and each of the leaves has a little white tip on the end of it. So it's a combination of gray-green with white tips. This is Hedwigia ciliata, which I like because I'm a big Harry Potter fan, and I like Hedwig, the owl. Growing just up the crack from it is a very dark cushion moss, which also has whitish tips on the leaves. So guess what? That might be an adaptation to growing in hot, dry areas. And this is Grimmia pilifera. Grimmia pilifera. So it forms cushions. So we have Hedwig forming cushions and Grimmia forming cushions. Further down, tucked in, are these even green patches of very short-leaved moss. And this is, as we've seen before, Dicranum montanum. And if you look at Dicranum from the edge, you see the red rhizoids on the stems, and it's an acrocarp type moss. So that's an indicator that this is a Dicranum. And then the short foliage suggests that it's Dicranum montanum. Now, another moss in here, which we have growing here, but also more on the top of the rock, is this common sidewalk crack moss. It grows in very extreme environments, sidewalk cracks, hot, dry areas. It has a whitish foliage, which probably grayish white foliage, which probably helps it tolerate the heat. And this is Bryum argentium, the silver moss or silver bryum. And Bryum argentium can form distinctive silver mounds, or sometimes it gets covered with these very distinctive nodding sporophytes. You can see these here. They come over and they get kind of rounded and oval and nod. So a combination of that silver foliage and these nodding sporophytes that grow on top of this, and you know you're looking at Bryum argentium, a very common urban sidewalk crack moss. And then growing also around over here on another rock is more Grimmia that we see. And here there's a little clump of probably what is Eulota hutchinsii. And these are all mosses that would be grouped as growing on granitic boulders. So acidic, not limey, but granitic rock. So that's an example of a moss map, and also the different mosses that grow out in the open on rocky substrates.